Why was D&D such an attractive target to leftists? And why has it been so relatively successful? Those are questions I've been contemplating for a little while now. We, of course, have seen an all-out assault on every traditional institution in the Western world over the last several years from the far left. These people have made inroads that would have been unthinkable to those of us who watched the Berlin Wall fall in real time. And the world repudiate a philosophy that every sane person realizes is a dangerous joke. I do believe the philosophy that politics is downstream from culture. We've seen the movies, literature, comics, video games, sports, and the tabletop gaming industry, as well as things as obscure as knitting, become infected with the sickness of societal rot disguised as social justice. It's put father against son, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. Now, there's plenty of other channels out there documenting the fall of all those other pillars. This one is, of course, devoted to tabletop RPG games. And I think RPG games like D&D were particularly attractive to attacks from these folks because the player base itself was already sort of left-leaning. I know this as a conservative and libertarian. I was active on a lot of original RPG-focused message boards back in the days of Internet 1.0. It was pretty easy to tell that I was part of a minority, politically speaking, but this wasn't really a problem back then. It wasn't really a problem, in fact, until around 2016. Gee, I wonder what could have happened then to turn half the world crazy. The player base was already sympathetic to the liberal cause, even if they weren't dyed-in-the-wool commies, at least not yet. And as it turns out, they could be radicalized fairly easily. I've always subscribed to the notion that gamers as a whole are not nearly the deep thinkers they're perceived to be. Couple this with a built-in inferiority complex that stemmed from society's disapproval of games like D&D from its inception to really just a few years ago, and the commissars really couldn't have asked for an easier target. I think the closest comparison to the rot of RPGs can be found in comics. As we know, DC and Marvel are just a sad shell of what they once were, as a direct result of the poison of leftism. But there are a couple of reasons why the infiltration of RPGs is a little bit different than it was in the comics industry. First of all, unlike comics, RPGs have this unique, performative aspect to them. That is appealing to folks with maybe just a little bit of a healthy ego, all the way up to the malignant narcissists that are attracted to the philosophy of leftism. Comics are kind of passive. You read them, you set them down. Movies, you go to and maybe you think about them for a little bit, or you forget about them and then just move on. But RPGs are a little bit different. They can stroke one's personal ego, but also allow them to powerfully virtue signal to a group of friends or strangers. Thanks to the popularity of shows like Critical Role, leftists can now reach more and more people with their live plays. Now, most of these are actually more like scripted performances that are almost unrecognizable to those of us who grew up in the 1980s playing this game around the kitchen table with a bunch of friends. But it kind of provides a feedback loop now. Wizards of the Coast will pump out an adventure either full of, or with maybe just a little hint of, modern-day political garbage, and then sit back as it's praised in reviews from shills, then performed in homes, game shops, online, further reinforcing the original message. It's actually quite powerful if you can get enough people to swallow it. RPGs are also a relatively cheap form of entertainment when you think about it. Yes, Wizards of the Coast is going to want to make people to start to pay monthly fees to use their virtual tabletop, and we'll have to see how successful that turns out to be. But until then, if you're a player, you can get by with just a player's handbook for D&D or Pathfinder, maybe a splat book or two. You get a lot of bang for buck if you can play regularly over the course of years. Contrast that with a comic, which you can read in about 20 minutes, and then you got to spend $6 a month, every month, just to follow the story. And that's just one story. Comics are, right now, just not a very good value for what you get, especially when you see the trash that DC and Marvel are putting out. Now, we always used to joke on this side of the fence that leftists were poor stooges living on ramen noodles, because they were too lazy to get a real job. And while that might be true in some cases, I think it's actually changed a little bit over the last few years and the whole work at home phenomenon. It's not so much that they don't have money, it's the fact that they don't want to waste cash that could otherwise go to their DoorDash habit on stuff that they too realize is complete garbage. Here you have to watch what they do rather than what they say. They love to praise material on Twitter and YouTube that's really nothing more than propaganda, but they don't actually buy this stuff in large numbers, or at least in numbers that you might think they do. Some of Wizards of the Coast's most leftist releases, like Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel, are also some of its worst-selling titles in recent years. And let's talk about Wizards of the Coast for a moment. I've already told you that the player base of the game was already susceptible to the left's messaging, but you also need a popular and dependable pipeline to pump this sewage out into the world. And boy, do they have that in Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast. From the radical Chris Perkins to the overall manager of the D&D line, Kyle Brink.
For people assumed that D&D players were all, white dudes in a basement. And so it's, in my viewpoint, honestly, guys like me can't leave soon enough.
Along with a host of creators who absolutely despise their core customer base of white males. It's also important to understand just how big D&D is in the RPG world. Many of you might not realize this, but by some accounts, D&D makes up as much as 70 to 75% of the RPG market. That's a little bit sobering to those of us who can see how they're destroying the brand by tying it to modern-day radical politics. It's also maddening to realize that they're using that clout to indoctrinate new players into a philosophy that has nothing to do with warriors and dragons, and everything to do with equity and punishment of people who have committed no wrong. Worse is the fact that almost 40% of the D&D player base is under 25 years old. Young people always do skew more liberal than the older generations, but the current polarization has them believing things like men can get pregnant, and that the DM in the game that you're playing springing a giant spider on the party is a reason to stop the game and pretend that it never happened, because one of the players is afraid of spiders. It's not that young people are necessarily dumber, it's that they have a shocking dearth of intellectual curiosity as a whole. And they also have a great desire to participate in what is essentially a hive mind. I mean, it was bad enough when millennials thought The Daily Show was thought-provoking. Now many of us would almost welcome a return to when lefties were just self-righteous hypocrites, as opposed to the dangerous sociopaths they're becoming. It's very clear that young people are picking up what Wizards of the Coast and their ideological allies like Paizo, Kobold Press, and Monte Cook Games are putting down. Safety tools are a perfect example of this. Coming out of nowhere 7 or 8 years ago, they're now more or less expected in any new D&D game you go into with strangers. Don't like what's going on? Whip out your X card and stop it. Presto. Dopamine hit, virtue signal, and sympathetic victim all at once. That card has the same lure to young gamers that heroin does to an addict. Brought to you and sanctioned by the mainstream RPG industry. Forget about dealing with your personal issues yourself. Now you can hold everyone at the table hostage to them too. Unfortunately, that means that in some respects, at least for now, Wizards of the Coast wins. The bad guys are winning. They're pumping out propaganda to a virtual monopoly, and right now the player base is welcoming of it. That is the bad news. The good news is that, as I said, the sales figures of some of these products are getting softer and softer. Plus, Wizards of the Coast can oftentimes be their own worst enemy. But for now, if you were looking at it from the outside, you'd say that this is a hobby that attracts more than the average number of Marxists. The question is, what do we do about it? Well, there is one thing we're doing already. I mean, there is still a chunk of the market out there for normies. And I just have to think that there are some young folks out there maybe nodding their head at all of this just to avoid trouble with their peers. But deep inside, they know how stupid it all is. So let's support and produce stuff that's made the old-fashioned way. Stuff you didn't need to get approved by the DNC before releasing. Stuff that focused on classic storytelling, that involved true imagination rather than dogma and little red books. The other thing we can do, and I think this is honestly just as important, is to point out just how stupid things like Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel and its like are. we can laugh at their artwork in comparison to the classics. They may have to protect it at first, but over time, it becomes self-evident what stands up as quality work and what's going to look hopelessly dated in 20 years. Well, that's all for now. Hope I've given you guys food for thought. If you think I missed something or want to add something to it, make sure you tell me so in the comments below. It really does help. Throw a like on the video if you did like this video. And if you want to see more, make sure you're subscribed to this channel with notifications turned on. If you check out my other content and it grabs you, you can always join the channel as a member for some exclusive content. I always appreciate that. And remember to tune in every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our weekly live stream called The Lair. We have a great and lively chat, and it's always a ton of fun. We hope to see you there. All right, so you guys take care and have a great rest of your day. Hello there. I want to take a few moments to thank our sponsors who are providing you guys a very special discount just for being a fan of this channel. All the sites and discount codes just for you can be found in the description of this video. Our old friends from Neckbeardia offer a great variety of products, from awesome miniatures to supplementary RPG material and even their own RPG rule sets. You just never know what new thing James is going to be cooking up over there, so make sure to bookmark their site and check back often. Crud Forge makes 2 great games that aren't afraid to poke a little fun at the people who, quite frankly, need a little fun poked at them. First is the quick and hilarious Virtue Signal, the game where you play a social justice warrior trying to attract followers to your cause before the other players can tear you down. Then there's the mammoth Portland Occupied Zone, or POZ. In this strategy game, you play as a complete disaster of a human being, trying to reshape Portland into a slacker Marxist utopia. Bring a few friends and warm up that throwing arm for some Molotov cocktails. Folks at Power Up Paradise are taking care of you with both a protective phone case and, when you flip it over, an ingenious Game Boy, which is built right into it. Go back to the golden age of video gaming and play dozens of challenging games that will delight and frustrate you in a good way. Mobile games are almost universally terrible, so why not take a step back when they did it right?
What qualifies you to be a U.S. Senator? You have 60 seconds.
Hi, good night, everybody.